Chapter 16. Battle for Control. During my years in the black street of ink, I often visited the Black Valleys, where coal is mined to warm the industrial heart of our nation and make it beat. Sometimes, in the Black Valleys, a sullen, muffled sound like the subterranean hammer blow of a giant vibrates through the air and makes the earth quiver. For a moment every soul in the valley is still, heads cocked on one side, spirit suddenly swept to a pitch of apprehension, listening. Then the cry goes up, "Something's wrong down below." Out of every cottage the women folk come at the run, their heads and shoulders cowled in grey shawls, and away to the pit head. Sometimes they wait days there until the last still figure is carried up from below, and there is no hope for the others, crushed or cut off from the daylight by millions of tons of rock and scree and earth. It was in the valleys that I first saw how women take on men's countenances when they are in grief. Then the taut, still, chiselled lines of the women's faces have a masculine appearance. The shape of one such face is etched forever in my memory. The lips slightly parted, bitterness fighting faith in the deep lights of the eyes. The cheeks and chin soaking wet through no rain, though no rain had fallen. Class means nothing, and hatreds mean nothing, and the old political cries and slogans mean nothing at the pithead on days like these. Manager's wife and miner's wife brew tea together, stamping to keep warm on the blackened mud around the shaft. It is a sisterhood of sorrow. Men from pit face and office who for years have not spoken about each other except in terms of abuse, go down together to face the trouble. They work until clothes, hands, and nails are torn. Sometimes they die in company, taking risks to cut their way swiftly to the entombed men. It is a brotherhood of travail. Danger, as well as grief, brings out that quality of selflessness and love in man which is not always apparent in normal times. I remember one night in London when the Blitz was at its height. For weeks on end, night after night, the Germans had been over the city, smashing, burning, destroying. A sullen, dogged resolve to see it through, because no other course of interest or of honour lay before us, had gripped the citizens of London. But they were dark and desperate days. Once late at night I began to grope my way through the blacked-out streets to keep an urgent newspaper appointment. I was wearing a steel helmet, which was necessary protection against the falling fragments of our own barrage. Every now and again I crouched in the corner of some doorway and flattened myself against a wall as the whistle of a bomb gave me a few seconds' warning before the jar and debris of the explosion. Suddenly, travelling much too fast for safety, a taxi came careering along the roadway. It screeched to a stop. I noticed that its roof had 2 mattresses strapped on it to catch any shell fragments that fell. The driver shouted to me, "Going my way, mate." In I hopped. He took me to my destination. In the blackout we overshot it. The driver turned his cab around, climbed out, and helped me with his torch to find the place I was looking for. I asked him how much I owed him. He refused any payment. "I was on my way home anyway, mate," he said, and with a grin and a wave drove off into the darkness. I have never seen him since. It was the same spirit I met in an immense factory. For several days, Doe and I, on our Suffolk farm, had heard the sound of distant explosions. They were the signals of one of the biggest events of military history, the Allied evacuation of Europe at Dunkirk. Then I was asked to visit a factory where some of the machines most vital to Britain's safety at that time were being produced. There had been much trouble in this industry, with strikes and constant hatred and bitterness. The official who showed me round said, "Most of our people work overtime now without being asked. For the only time in my experience, some of the men are working to finish the job without claiming payment, so we have to make special inquiries each week to see they get what is due to them. Our maximum production schedule has been exceeded by almost 50%. Sad that it seems to need the bad times to bring out the best in men. For paradoxically, failure to bring out the best in man makes the bad times inevitable. And, in spite of the danger and uncertainty and anxiety of those days, were we not happier? Do you remember the comradeship and zest which sprang up among us in those dark hours and created a classless society overnight, as all gave for the nation? For a time, we knew the joy and liberty which comes to the spirit of men when concern for ourselves is merged and lost in concern for our fellows. How can we establish and extend this spirit in the post-war age? If we fail to do so, we shall assuredly lose the peace. Already in extreme interests of both right and left are massing their forces and manoeuvring against each other. They are preparing to make industry a battlefield as soon as the war of arms is over. Their battle line of peace will be a battle for control. Management will fight to control labour. Labour will fight to control management. Government may attempt to control both. Within the ranks of management itself, the battle will be on. Will councils of progress or of reaction prevail? One big employer of labour said in my hearing the other day, "Don't worry about labour troubles. When normal returns, we can deal with them with our own weapons." By normal he meant unemployment at the million mark and over as a constant threat to every working man. The materialists of the right treat labour as a commodity to be taken on and thrown off as convenient. They treat employees as ciphers in a ledger, as things, not people. Some of them want to swing management into full-scale class war, to coerce and hold down the working classes. They want a class war for just the same reason as extremists of the left, because they think they can win it. Other employers, men of integrity, treat their employees well and are loved by them. Some see the fight, the war of ideas. Some see and fight the war of ideas. Others are proud of their paternalism. They cannot understand the criticism that paternalism is a drug to mask the symptoms of a diseased system, that it is a local anesthetic, not a radical cure. Yet they too bear a share of responsibility in the present situation. They are like men who are busy planning to paint their own cabins while the ship is sinking. There were some good employers in Russia before the revolution. They got on splendidly with their work people and paid them good wages. But that fight did not bring the revolution of change, which their nation desperately needed, nor, incidentally, when the revolution of blood came, did it save them. They remained part of a state of affairs which had to change. They failed to see or to fight the war of ideas. They had no plan big enough to remake the age they lived in. Management has a key part to play in remaking the age we live in. The community needs its experience and cannot find that elsewhere, but it will be management which is neither reactionary nor paternalist, but revolutionary. That is, management which has an entirely fresh conception of the function of industry. We are in industry for what we can get out of it, is reactionary and wrong. We are in an industry for what we can give mankind, is revolutionary and right. It is an approach which may mean fewer dividends for the few, but will mean more happiness for the many. A new spirit in the hearts of the industrialists would swiftly put industry at the service of mankind, and the first function of industry is service. It is to warm, feed, house, and clothe the masses of the world. When the so-called captains of industry, and indeed all who are involved in industry, take the same responsibility for serving mankind as they take for the provision of their own family, we shall stand on the threshold of a new age. Industrialists, who still think in terms of sectional gain and self-interest, are out of date. It is this type of inferior thinking which plays into the hands of the extremists of the left, men who preach class war and hope to obtain promotion in it. They are out for power. They bid intelligently for it. To them, a grievance is something to be exploited for its own sake, rather than something to be put right for the sake of those who suffer from it. Often those who advocate class warfare have a far more vivid picture of the destiny of the workers than some of the labour leaders of today. They offer the workers red blood instead of a blue print. Within the ranks of labour, two sections struggled for mastery. Shall extremists there, who love an alien ideology more than their own country, control the men who wish to maintain and recreate the best traditions of trade unionism? Or shall they be controlled by them? The sound elements in labour are baffled by the subversive forces. They do not realize exactly what their game is, except that they do not like it. They do not recognize the war of ideas, and so they risk defeat in it. Many of them lack absolute standards of faith or conduct with which to measure the proposals and dealings of the materialists. And when they apply the mere test of expediency, they find that, though they may not like it, the plan of the class war boys is usually more expedient than their own. They discover that you cannot cure a passion with a mere program. You cannot turn back passion by political maneuvers or a plain rebuke. It takes a passion to cure a passion, a plan to beat a plan. Sound labour needs an ideology and faith to answer the faith and ideology of the extremists. It needs fighters who see the war of ideas clearly and will fight as fearlessly, intelligently, and publicly on one side as the extremists on the other. Otherwise, sound labour will go under. The British labour movement sprang from Christianity. Faith gave it the fiery conviction of its early appeal. The old socialists had a philosophy which prevented them from lining up with class hatred and the use of armed revolution. They got a positive picture of free labour in a God-controlled world. It was a supranational ideal. So advocates of class warfare found it difficult to make such headway, much headway. Keir Hardie was the prophet of the revolutionary programme of traditional socialism. His challenge to Labour was the same as Labour's challenge to society, the unselfish living and thinking which alone can finally outlaw greed and hate and fear. Selfishness, he wrote in 1903, is not by any means a monopoly of the rich. the same causes which lead the rich employer to lower wages or the rich landlord to raise rents operate quite as freely with working men when opportunity and self-interest dictate a like course. He scorned the conception of the class war. It is, he said, a delegation of the socialist movement to drag it down to the mere level of a struggle for supremacy between two contending factions. His appeal was not to the material interests of one class, but to the moral conscience of the whole nation. The carpenter of Nazareth, and not Karl Marx, was the inspiration of this great-hearted revolutionary, this champion of the oppressed. So it was with the Tolpuddle martyrs, the men who in 1834 were sent to Botany Bay for their efforts to establish an agricultural union, and whose fighting faith was an inspiration to millions who followed. From prison they sent out their battle cry. God is our guide, no swords we draw, we kindle not war's battle fires. By reason, union, justice, law, we claim the birthright of our sires. Now British Labour has, in a large degree, cut its root in fighting faith. The fruit has gone too. It was this to which Ben Tillett referred when on his deathbed he said, "The trade union movement should stand for more than wages and sordid commercialism. It must develop a soul if it is to do its job of uplifting humanity." With the rebirth of that spirit from which it sprang, the British Labour movement will far outshine its past. It can become tomorrow more than it ever was yesterday. Labour led by God can remake the world. Over the next quarter century, Labour will have opportunities of governing great nations. Already the most far-sighted elements in Labour are beginning to make their biggest contribution to the nation by bringing statesmanship into industry. Men like these are recognizing the greatest need of industry today. It is to clarify the true battle line. Men must come to see that they have been falsely and skillfully aligned on a front which is not the real front, so they are losing the real battle all the time. The real battle line in industry is not between labour and management, where some would draw it. It is not between left and right, where others draw it. It is between the constructive forces of left and right, labour and management, together on the one side, and the unpatriotic forces of selfishness in both that make for division on and conflict on the other. If labour and management will work together, they can win this fight. Neither can do it alone. As teamwork in the service of the nation is pioneered by constructive elements in industry, so teamwork will grow between the nations which industry serves. For when sections within a nation, both management and labour, approach industry with the tiger mind of, "What can we grab for ourselves?" that tiger mentality is carried to international trade conferences. So we have breakdowns which affect the lives of every individual in the world. But with a new approach, international conferences can become not a battle for markets, but an alliance for service, when all plan for all to be adequately housed, warmed, fed, and clothed. Trade will cease to divide the United Nations, but instead will unite the world. In this new spirit lies our one and only hope of winning the peace and securing it for our children. Men of courage in many countries have taken up the struggle. Cecil Morrison of Ottawa, for example, is typical of thousands of employers. He baked the King's birthday cake when King George and Queen Elizabeth visited Canada in 1939. His friends call him the Happy Baker. But Morrison was not always happy. His life was poisoned by hatred of everyone who interfered with him, especially competitors and organised labour. Once in Saskatchewan, he broke a strike. Subsequently, he lost his business by his strong-arm methods, and when later in Ottawa he discovered two men trying to organize his plant for a bakery union, he sacked them. The Canadian Congress of Labour took up the case. Mosher, its president, protested to the Minister of Labour. Morrison decided to brazen it out, saying that the men were laid off because of slack times and said that their union activities has nothing to do with it. Just then, Morrison began to see that he was fighting on the wrong side in the war of ideas. He decided he must beat materialism in himself before he could help build sound industry. He asked God what he could do, and as a result not only reinstated the two men and paid them a month's back salary, but wrote and told Mosher and the Minister of Labour the true facts. By return of post he received this letter from the Canadian Congress of Labour. May I say that in 30 years' experience in the labour movement, I have never known any employer to do such a fine thing as you have done. If the spirit you have shown in adjusting this matter could be applied to industry generally, this world would become a very different place. Today, the Happy Baker is fighting together with many labour leaders to bring that spirit to the whole of Canadian industry. Morrison has meanwhile had the opportunity of making a national demonstration in his industry. In September 1939, he united the bakeries of the Dominion under a national council and gave them the aim of keeping the price of bread at its pre-war level. The council demonstrated such a universal will to cooperate and economize that the Canadian government repealed certain taxation on flour to assist them in their aim. They also appointed Morrison Administrator of Bread and Bakery Products for the Dominion. The overall cost of living in Canada has to date risen 18% since war started. The cost of bread ingredients has risen 26%, and labour costs 20%, but the price of bread has not risen 1 farthing. In Britain, two young trade unionists offer a first-rate example of industrial statesmanship by the ordinary man who sees the battle line clearly. In the area where they work, the bitterness between the men's leader and the manager of a large-scale concern had created difficulty and deadlock. At a critical period of World War II, the men's leader called a strike which might involve 5,000 families. Work stopped. The two young trade unionists talked things over. Then they called on the men's leader and asked him to come and see the manager with them. He said, "Not me. I'm not going to crawl to that. You can guess what." The two young men then went to the manager's house. They asked him to write to the men's leader inviting him up to his house. The manager refused. Then these two young fellows said something like this: "Look here, sir, this bad feeling causes endless suffering. It must stop. Why don't you take the first step?" After 2 hours' talk, the manager pocketed his pride, and they got their letter. The men's leader was so astonished at its friendly tone that he pocketed his pride and went with them. After several hours' conference, every personal difficulty was ended. A provisional settlement, agreed unanimously by the employees in the morning, was drafted. The men went back to work. The manager agreed to meet the men's leader face to face once a month and try to reach with them in a spirit of honesty. The right answer to all problems arising in the undertakings within his control. From that moment, a new spirit began to grow. Grievances, which for years had rankled, started to move towards solution. So every family connected with those huge concerns, and the nation's interests also were safeguarded by the industrial statesmanship of two ordinary working trade unionists. These two young fellows are out to fight the war of ideas throughout industry. They are out to build teamwork in the best interests of the nation and in the spirit of Keir Hardie and the Labour pioneers. I think the Beatles said it best. We can work it out. That might sound a bit corny, but I think what we're getting from that chapter, well, you can have your own interpretation on it. But sometimes I think pride gets in the way, this doggedness. Like, I know somebody, a person, and in some ways they are admirably black and white. In other words, right is right and wrong is wrong. And, I'd discuss with my wife about this person, and I'd say, you know what? That person's too black and white. Life doesn't work like that. There's got to be a bit of give and take. There's got to be a bit of biting your lip and swallowing your pride, because there are grey areas which, if you sow the seeds of cooperation and willingness to listen, give a little, take a little, those grey areas can flourish into harmony and friendship. Now I'm sounding like the book, and I don't mean to sound like that. But you know what I'm saying? If that person was a little less obstinate at times, a little less virtuous, and was able to just realize one thing, and it's this: people are human. They have frailties. They have flaws. They make mistakes. They have weaknesses. They're only human. And if you can enter into negotiation, not just out for yourself, but willing sometimes to just let it be, back to the Beatles, I think the world would be a better place. What about you? Comments? I doubt it, but comments are below. And I'll see you for chapter 17.